Stepmom kicked me out, saying I wasn't family. 10 years later, karma hit hard. So I was 8 when my parents split up, and it was messy, like most divorces are. I didn't really get it back then. All I knew was my dad and mom weren't together anymore, and suddenly I was bouncing between their houses, trying to figure out what normal was supposed to feel like again. Not long after, my dad met Lauren. At first, she seemed like she could be all right, you know? She'd talk to me like she actually cared, and would even bring me snacks when she visited. I thought, hey, maybe she's gonna be like those cool stepmoms you see on TV. But man, was I wrong. Less than a year after the divorce, my dad remarried her. It all happened so quick, like I barely had time to wrap my head around my parents not being together, and suddenly, there's this new woman in our life acting like she runs the show. At first, it was little things. She'd give me these weird looks if I wanted to spend time with my dad, like I was intruding or something. And then, slowly, she started pulling my dad away. It was like a switch flipped the second they got married. She wasn't the friendly woman I thought she was before. She was different. She made it clear I wasn't part of the picture she had in her head for her perfect family. And the worst part, my dad just went along with it, like he was too wrapped up in his new life to notice how much I was getting pushed out. I still remember one of the first times it really hit me that things were never going to be the same. My dad promised we'd go out together, just the two of us. It had been a while since we'd done that, and I was excited. But then, last minute, Lauren suddenly had plans with him, and I got left behind. It wasn't even a one-time thing either. After that, it felt like any time I wanted to spend time with him, she'd pop up with some excuse or plan, and he'd always pick her, every single time. And then there was Cora, Lauren's baby. I didn't have any issues with Cora at first. She was just a baby after all. But Lauren used her as a reason to keep me around and make me useful. Whenever they wanted to go out or have date night, guess who had to babysit? Yeah, me. I'd be promised all these things like, oh, you can hang out with your friends later, or we'll do something fun next time. But it never happened. Plans would change last minute, and suddenly I was stuck at home while they went out. It was honestly like I was their backup plan for whenever they wanted alone time. They'd say stuff like, you're such a great big sister to Cora, trying to make it seem like they appreciated it, but I knew what was really going on. I was a free babysitter, and that was it. And the weirdest part? It felt like Cora was the only thing that mattered to them. When they were home, it was all about her. They'd do all these fun activities with her, and if I tried to join in, Lauren would just brush me off, saying something like, oh, this is just a little mommy and Cora time. Or she'd tell me to go do something else, and my dad wouldn't even say a word. One time, they took Cora to a fair that I'd been wanting to go to for ages. I'd mentioned it to my dad a few times, hoping we could go together. But nope, Lauren planned it all out, and they just left me behind. I found out they went when I got back home from my grandma's. Apparently, they didn't want to bother me, and thought it would be better as a family-only outing. Like, what the hell? Wasn't I supposed to be part of the family too? That's the thing that really got to me. How my dad just stood there not saying anything. I mean, he was supposed to have my back, right? But he didn't. It was like he was so caught up in keeping Lauren happy that he didn't care if I felt left out. I started to notice this happening more and more. Anytime something fun came up, like trips to the beach, movie nights, or going out to eat, I'd suddenly have chores or I'd be sent off to stay with my grandma. Don't get me wrong, I love my grandma. She's always been there for me, and she's one of the few people who treated me like I mattered. But it wasn't hard to see what was going on. Lauren was using these chores and family plans to make sure I wasn't around, and my dad let it happen. It got so bad that I just started staying in my room when I was over there. What was the point of trying to fit in when it was clear they didn't want me there? Every time I'd come out, Lauren would have some passive-aggressive comment or look, like I was invading her space. And my dad? He'd just sit there, like he didn't notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. I think the worst part was when I tried to bring it up to him. I remember sitting him down one day, hoping we could actually talk about it. I told him how I felt left out, how I was always the one babysitting Cora and missing out on things I wanted to do. He just gave me this tired look and said something like, Lauren's doing her best. You need to understand, it's not easy for her either. I wanted to scream. How was any of this about her? I was the one getting pushed aside, not her. But he just didn't get it. Or maybe he didn't want to. It was like he had blinders on, and all he cared about was making his new wife happy. It felt like no matter what I said or did, nothing would change. That was when I realized things weren't going to get better. I was stuck. My dad had chosen Lauren, and I was just an extra piece that didn't fit in the puzzle. So I stopped trying. I stopped asking to go on trips with them. I stopped trying to join in. If they needed a babysitter for Cora, I'd just do it because fighting back didn't do anything except make things worse. It was like the less I said, the less I was noticed, and at least that way, I didn't have to deal with Lauren's attitude. Looking back now, I can't believe how blind my dad was. Or maybe he wasn't blind at all. Maybe he just didn't care. He had this new, perfect family, and I was a reminder of the life he left behind. Lauren wanted me out of the picture, and he was fine with it. It hurt to realize that, but it was the truth. And once I accepted that, it made it easier to plan my escape for later. By the time I was 10, I'd already learned to keep my distance and not get too attached to any promises. It was all just words anyway. By the time I was 10, I pretty much knew my place in my dad's new family. I was there to help out, babysit Cora, and keep out of the way when they wanted their family time. The thing is, no one actually said it like that. Lauren would always find a way to phrase it nicely, like, "Oh, Cora's still young, and it's important for her to have some special time with us." But it was clear as day. I was the one who wasn't included. I remember this one time when it really hit me how things were going to be. It was early in the summer, and my dad had promised we'd do something special together since I'd been doing well in school. I was excited because, honestly, it'd been ages since we did anything, just the two of us. So when he mentioned going to an amusement park, I got my hopes up. I started planning everything in my head, what rides I'd go on, what snacks I'd want. I mean, I was just a kid, and I was desperate for some real father-daughter time. Well, a few days before we were supposed to go, I overheard Lauren on the phone. She was talking to one of her friends, and I could tell she was planning something. She mentioned the amusement park, so I thought, okay, maybe she's getting things ready for the trip. But then I heard her say, "Yeah, it's just going to be the three of us. I want it to be a special day for our little family." My heart sank. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to process what she just said. Three of them. My dad, Lauren, and Cora. No mention of me. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still stung. I went to my room, trying to figure out how to bring it up to my dad, but I didn't get the chance. The next morning, Lauren came up with a big smile, saying, "Hey, your grandma needs some help this weekend. She's been asking for you, and I know she'd love to have you over." It was so fake. I could tell she was just trying to get me out of the house. But I didn't want to cause a fight, so I agreed. I packed my bag and spent the weekend at my grandma's. I love her, and we had a good time, but the whole time, all I could think about was how my dad, Lauren, and Cora were at that amusement park, having a blast without me. When I got back home, it was like they'd had the time of their lives. Cora was running around with one of those giant stuffed animals you win at the carnival games, and my dad was showing her pictures from the day. They were all smiles and laughs, and I just stood there feeling like I was invisible. Lauren noticed me, and with this fake sweet voice said, "Oh, we didn't want to bother you since you were helping out your grandma. We thought it was best to let you have some alone time with her." It was such a load of crap. They didn't want to bother me because they didn't want me there. Simple as that. And my dad just nodded along, like everything was fine. He didn't even ask me how I felt about it, like my opinion didn't matter. I wanted to scream, but I kept quiet. What was the point? If I said anything, I knew they'd just turn it around on me, make it seem like I was overreacting or being difficult. From that point on, it was like a pattern. Anytime something fun came up, whether it was the amusement park, going to the beach, or even just a movie night, I'd get shuffled off somewhere else. Sometimes it was my grandma's. Sometimes it was, "Hey, why don't you go to your friend's house?" And if I ever tried to join in, Lauren would have some excuse ready. It was either, "This is just a mommy and Cora day," or "We planned this a while ago, and it wouldn't be fair to change it now." One weekend, they had this big beach day planned. I overheard them talking about it earlier in the week, and I was waiting for my dad to say something like, "Hey, why don't you come with us?" But of course, he didn't. Instead, the day before, Lauren comes up to me and says, "I know how much you love spending time with your grandma. How about you go stay with her for the weekend?" I could have argued, but I already knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. So I went to my grandma's, and sure enough, when I got back, they had all these stories about the beach, how Cora played in the sand, how they had ice cream by the boardwalk, and how much fun they had. I smiled and nodded along, pretending like I was okay with it, but inside I was fuming. It was clear they didn't want me there, and my dad was just letting it happen. The worst was how Lauren would always spin it like it was some great opportunity for me. "Oh, your grandma loves having you around. I know you enjoy spending time with your friends. It's important for Cora to have some special moments." It was all just a way to keep me out of their plans. And the thing that sucked the most was how my dad went along with all of it, acting like nothing was wrong. There was one time when I finally snapped. They were planning another trip, this time to some big water park that I'd been dying to go to. I waited for them to ask if I wanted to come, but when Lauren started talking about family bonding, I knew it was going to be the same as always. When she tried to send me off to my grandma's again, I told her I didn't want to go. I told her I wanted to go with them instead. She gave me this annoyed look and said, "Oh well, we already bought tickets for 3." I looked at my dad, hoping he'd step in and say something, but he just shrugged, like there was nothing he could do. That's when I lost it. I told them how unfair it was, how they always excluded me and only treated me like part of the family when it was convenient for them. Lauren acted shocked, like she had no idea what I was talking about. She started with the same lines she always used, saying how much my grandma appreciated me helping her out, and how they just wanted to make sure I had quality time with her. But it wasn't about that. It never was. It was about pushing me out, and I was done pretending I didn't see it. My dad didn't say much, just the usual, "We'll talk about this later." But we never did. It was like every time I tried to bring up how I felt, he'd brush it off or act like it wasn't a big deal. I could have been screaming into a void for all it mattered. I started to realize that no matter what I did, Lauren was always going to find a way to exclude me, and my dad wasn't going to stand up for me. They had their perfect little family picture, and I just wasn't part of it. So I stopped trying. I figured it was easier that way. Less disappointment, less feeling like an outsider in my own dad's life. Looking back, I don't know why I even bothered to hope things would change. It was clear that, in their eyes, I wasn't part of their family. I was just some extra baggage they had to manage, and as long as I stayed out of the way, everything was fine for them. By the time I turned 14, I had pretty much given up on trying to fit into my dad and Lauren's little perfect world. It was just easier to stay out of the way. I spent most of my time at my grandma's, in my room, or hanging out with my friends when I could. The less I was around them, the less they could push me aside or use me for babysitting. But even with all the avoiding, it still felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells in that house. One day, I had this big plan to hang out with my friends. It was one of those rare weekends where all of us were free, and we had it set for weeks. We were going to hit the mall, see a movie, and grab food. I was really looking forward to it because, honestly, it was one of the few things I had that made me feel like a normal kid. I had been keeping to myself so much at my dad's that hanging out with my friends was the only time I felt, well, included. Of course, the night before, Lauren came up to me with that fake smile she always put on when she was about to drop some favor she needed. She was like, "Hey, so your dad and I are going out tomorrow, and we really need you to watch Cora." I just stared at her, trying not to lose my cool. I told her I had plans already and that I'd been looking forward to them for weeks. She acted all surprised, like she hadn't known, but I knew she did. She always knew. She put on her usual act, sighing dramatically and saying, "Well, we don't have anyone else. I thought you'd want to help your family." I felt my blood boiling. This wasn't helping family. This was them using me because they didn't want to bother finding someone else. I told her straight up that it wasn't fair. I'd been babysitting Cora all the time, missing out on so many things, and I deserved one day to hang out with my friends. Lauren's whole face changed. She dropped the nice act real quick and said, "You need to start stepping up and helping out more. This is your family now." That set me off. I told her that it didn't feel like family when I was just there to do chores or babysit Cora. I said how they'd leave me out of everything fun and only pull me in when it was convenient for them. I was tired of it. She just gave me this look like I was being dramatic and said, "We'll talk about this later with your dad." I knew what that meant. It was going to be another one of those talks where I was made out to be the problem. So I just left the room. I knew my plans for the next day were dead in the water, and there was no point fighting it anymore. The next morning, my friends were texting me, asking when I'd be ready. I felt like crap having to tell them I couldn't go. I tried to make up some excuse about a family emergency because I didn't want to admit that, once again, I was stuck babysitting. I could tell some of them were annoyed. I mean, who wouldn't be? I'd bailed on plans so many times because of Lauren's last-minute requests. It was getting to the point where I knew they'd just stop asking me to hang out altogether. Later that day, my dad came home, and Lauren wasted no time dragging me into the kitchen for one of their family talks. My dad looked tired, like he already knew what was coming, and didn't want to deal with it. Lauren started with her usual speech about family responsibility and how I needed to do my part. She made it sound like I was this lazy, ungrateful kid who never lifted a finger around the house, which was total BS. I did more than my fair share, but of course, that didn't matter to them. When she was done, my dad just nodded along and said, "You know, she's right. We need to work together as a family." I looked at him, feeling this mix of anger and sadness. I asked him, "When's the last time we did anything as a family? Every time something fun happens, I'm not included. I'm just here to babysit Cora when it's convenient for you two." He didn't have much to say. He just mumbled some stuff about how things were busy and how I needed to understand that raising a family takes effort from everyone. I felt like I was banging my head against a wall. It didn't matter what I said, he was always going to side with Lauren. That's when I realized it wasn't just Lauren's fault. My dad was the problem too. He was the one letting her treat me like an outsider, and he was the one who kept pretending everything was fine. It hit me that he wasn't going to change. He was too wrapped up in his new life with Lauren and Cora to even notice how much he was losing me. And that sucked. It really did. After that, I stopped trying. I stopped arguing, stopped asking to be included, and just went along with whatever they wanted. If they needed me to babysit, I did it without a word. If they told me to go to my grandma's, I packed my bag and left. It was easier to just go along with it than to fight back and end up feeling even more alone. I started distancing myself more and more. I'd spend as much time as I could at my grandma's or with my mom when I had the chance. I just didn't want to be around them anymore. It felt like I was some ghost in their house, just floating around, only there when they needed something. It was like I didn't exist unless they needed a favor. The weird part was, the more I pulled away, the less they seemed to notice. They'd go on with their lives, having their outings, their family dinners, and their little adventures with Cora. And I'd watch from the sidelines, pretending it didn't bother me, but it did. It bothered me a lot. I think the moment that really made me decide to give up was when my birthday came around. I hadn't expected much. I knew better than that by now, but it still hurt when they barely acknowledged it. Lauren baked a cake, but it was one of those small ones that seemed more like an afterthought than anything. They put some candles on it, sang a quick happy birthday, and that was it. I was hoping maybe my dad would have something planned, even if it was just the two of us grabbing ice cream or something. But nope, he didn't even try. The next day, they went out again, just the three of them. When they came back, they didn't even bother to hide the fact that they'd been at an arcade. Cora was running around showing off all the toys she won, and I was just there, like I always was, sitting in my room and pretending not to care. That was when I made up my mind. I was done trying to be part of their family. I figured if they didn't want me around, fine. I'd just focus on getting through school, hanging out with my friends when I could, and planning my escape. It was pretty clear I wasn't going to find my place in their perfect little world, so why keep trying? From that point on, I felt like I was counting down the days until I could finally get out for good. By the time I turned 16, I had one thing on my mind: getting out of that house. I'd been counting down the days for a while, and it was finally time to make my move. My mom had been asking for a while if I wanted to come live with her full time, and after everything with my dad and Lauren, it was an easy decision. Honestly, it felt like the only way I'd ever have any peace. My mom and I had talked about it before, but I kept putting it off because, deep down, I guess I still had this hope that my dad would finally step up. But after years of being pushed aside and used as a free babysitter, I knew nothing was going to change. Lauren was always going to be his priority, and I was just an extra that didn't fit into their picture-perfect life. So I finally said yes to my mom's offer. I planned everything carefully, figuring out how to tell my dad without it turning into a massive fight. I was nervous, but I was also done pretending like things were fine. I just needed to rip the Band-Aid off and go. I waited for the right moment, one of those rare times when it was just me and my dad at home, no Lauren around to butt in. I remember sitting him down at the kitchen table, my hands shaking a bit, because I knew this was going to be a big deal. I told him I wanted to move in with my mom full time, that I didn't feel like I was part of the family anymore. I laid it all out: how Lauren had been excluding me for years, how I was always treated like a nanny instead of his kid, and how I was tired of feeling like I didn't belong. He just sat there, staring at the table for a while before finally looking up at me. "You know, Lauren's been trying her best to make this work," he said, like that was supposed to make everything okay. I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd told him, that's all he had to say. It was like he didn't even hear me. I told him again how I felt, that it wasn't fair how I'd been treated, how they always left me out of everything fun but made sure to use me whenever they needed something. I thought maybe if I said it all, if I made it really clear, he'd finally understand. But instead, he just sighed and said, "You're being too sensitive. Lauren wants to include you, you just don't see it." That was the moment I knew for sure that he was never going to get it. No matter what I said, he was always going to side with Lauren. He was so wrapped up in his new life with her and Cora that he couldn't even see what was happening right in front of him. I felt this wave of frustration, but also this weird sense of relief. At least now, I didn't feel guilty about leaving. When I told him I'd already talked to my mom about moving in, he didn't even argue. He just nodded, like he'd already made up his mind that if I wanted to go, then fine, I could go. He said, "If that's what you want, then I won't stop you." No fight, no trying to convince me to stay. It was almost like he didn't care, and maybe he didn't. I packed my things that night. Lauren wasn't home, which honestly felt like a blessing because I didn't want to deal with any fake sympathy or her trying to guilt trip me into staying. I kept everything quick, throwing my clothes and stuff into bags and boxes. The whole time I kept expecting my dad to come into my room to try and talk me out of it, or at least say something that showed he cared. But he never did. My mom came to pick me up, and I loaded my stuff into her car. When I was done, I went back inside to say goodbye to my dad. He was standing in the hallway, looking kind of awkward, like he didn't know what to say. He hugged me, but it felt like one of those half-hearted hugs you give to someone you don't really know that well. He said, "Take care of yourself, okay?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, you too." It was short and it felt empty, but I didn't know what else to say. Part of me was hoping for some grand gesture, like he'd finally realize what he was losing and ask me to stay. But he didn't. He just stood there, letting me go without a fight. Lauren still hadn't come back by the time I left. I didn't know if she even knew I was leaving that day, and honestly, I didn't care. I was done trying to fit into her little version of family. I got into my mom's car, and as we drove off, I kept looking back at the house, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. It was the place I grew up, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Moving in with my mom was a relief. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. She didn't expect anything from me except to be myself, and that felt amazing. I didn't have to walk on eggshells or pretend to be fine when I wasn't. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. My mom didn't push me to talk about everything right away. She just let me settle in, which I appreciated. But eventually, we did sit down and I told her everything. How Lauren had made me feel like an outsider, how my dad never stood up for me, and how I was just tired of being treated like an extra. She was furious, but not at me. She was mad at my dad for letting it happen, and that made me feel like I wasn't crazy for being upset. My mom made it clear that I was welcome there as long as I needed, no strings attached. It was so different from how things felt at my dad's. No one was making me feel guilty or like I had to earn my place. It was just normal. I realized how much I'd missed that. The first few weeks living with my mom, I kept expecting to hear from my dad. I thought maybe he'd call, ask me to come back, or at least check in to see how I was doing. But the phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but it still hurt. I'd hoped, deep down, that maybe me leaving would be the wake-up call he needed. But it wasn't. It was like I'd never even been there in the first place. The thing is, as much as it sucked to accept, I knew I made the right choice. I couldn't keep waiting around for my dad to be the parent I needed. I had my own life to live, and I deserved to be somewhere I actually felt wanted. Living with my mom wasn't just about escaping my dad and Lauren. It was about finding a place where I didn't have to prove myself to be accepted. It was weird adjusting to a new routine, but it felt good. I focused on school, started hanging out with my friends more, and even got a part-time job. I was building a life that was mine, and I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'd be left out again. For once, things felt like they were falling into place. Looking back now, I don't regret leaving. It was the best decision I could have made for myself. Maybe my dad and Lauren have their own version of what happened, but I know the truth. And honestly, I'm done trying to fix things or make them see my side. I did what I had to do, and I'm better off because of it. After moving in with my mom, things started to feel normal again, which was a weird adjustment after all those years at my dad's place. I felt lighter, like I didn't have to keep pretending everything was okay. For once, I wasn't the babysitter, the extra, or the afterthought. I was just me. My mom was great about giving me space, but also being there when I needed to talk. And honestly, that's exactly what I needed. A few months went by and I got into a good routine. I was doing online school and my grades were solid. I also picked up a part-time job at a local store to save up some money and keep myself busy. My friends and I were hanging out more too, now that I wasn't constantly canceling plans. It was like for the first time in forever, I was living my life on my terms. But then, one night, my mom and I went out for dinner, and we ran into someone I hadn't seen in years, Jacob. He was the son of some of my dad's old friends. We'd hung out a lot as kids when our parents would get together. He was always nice to me, even when I was dealing with all the stuff at my dad's. He'd moved away for a while, but apparently, he was back in town for college. We got to talking, catching up on everything. He asked why he hadn't seen me around my dad's place in so long, and I told him the truth. I'd moved in with my mom full time. I didn't go into all the details, but I mentioned how things had been rough with Lauren, and it was just better for me to be with my mom. He looked surprised, like he had no idea what I was talking about. He told me that my dad and Lauren had been telling people that my mom manipulated the courts to get full custody of me, which was a total lie. They'd made it sound like I'd been taken away against my will, like my mom was this evil mastermind pulling all the strings. It took everything in me not to roll my eyes right then and there. It was just so typical of them, twisting the story to make themselves look like the victims. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let them keep spreading that nonsense. So I told Jacob the real story, how I'd chosen to leave because I was tired of being treated like a babysitter and feeling like an outsider in my own dad's house. I told him about all the times they'd excluded me from trips and how Lauren made me feel like I didn't belong. I didn't hold back. Jacob listened the whole time, and by the end of it, he looked shocked. He said, "I had no idea. I always thought your dad and Lauren were doing their best." Hearing that just reminded me of how good they were at putting on a show for everyone else. When other people were around, they acted like the perfect family, like everything was all smiles and sunshine. But the second the door closed, it was a completely different story. It felt good, though, to finally tell someone the truth, even if it was just one person. A few days later, I started getting texts from some of my dad's friends, the ones who knew me when I was younger. They were checking in, saying they'd heard about what really happened and asking if I was okay. I didn't realize it at the time, but Jacob had apparently told his parents, who then spread the word to their whole friend group. It wasn't long before everyone in my dad and Lauren's social circle knew what was really going on, and let's just say, my dad and Lauren weren't too happy about it. One day, out of nowhere, I get a call from a number I didn't recognize. I usually ignore those, but something told me to pick up. It was Lauren. She'd gotten a new number, probably because I'd blocked her old one. She started off all sweet, acting like she missed me and was so worried about me. But then she got straight to the point. She said, "We need to talk about these rumors. They're making things really difficult for us." I didn't even know what to say at first. Rumors? These weren't rumors. They were facts. I told her that. I said, "I didn't spread any rumors. I just told people what happened." She started going on about how I was making things harder for Cora and how all their friends were treating them differently now. She tried to guilt trip me, saying, "You're a good daughter, and we know you'll do the right thing for your family." I almost laughed. My family? They made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't part of that. When it was time for fun trips and outings, I was just an extra. But now that they needed me to fix their reputation, suddenly I was family again. I told her straight up, "You and Dad made your choices. You can't expect me to fix things when I wasn't even included in your life." She didn't take that well. She started going on about how Cora was really upset, how she didn't understand why her friends were ignoring her now, and how I needed to think about her. It was the same line she'd used before, making me feel like it was my job to fix things for them. But this time, I wasn't having it. I told her, "Cora's not my responsibility. You and Dad chose to treat me like I didn't belong, so don't expect me to step up now." She tried arguing, but I hung up. I was done with that conversation. After that, I started getting messages from a few of my relatives saying I needed to help the family and that Cora was just a kid who didn't deserve this. It felt like they were all piling on, trying to make me feel bad for finally standing up for myself. But here's the thing. None of them were there when I was being left out, treated like a nanny, or ignored by my own dad. Where were they when I was crying in my room because I felt like an outsider in my own family? They didn't care back then, so why should I care now? Just because things weren't going well for my dad and Lauren didn't mean I owed them anything. They made their choices, and now they had to deal with the consequences. I still feel bad for Cora sometimes because, yeah, she's just a kid, and she didn't do anything wrong. But at the same time, she's not my kid. She's not my responsibility. I'm not going to let them manipulate me into fixing their problems when they didn't even care about me until it was convenient for them. At this point, I'm just focusing on my life. My dad and Lauren can deal with the fallout of their own actions. They had their chance to be a real family to me, and they blew it. I'm not going to waste any more time trying to fix things for people who never made me feel like I was part of their family in the first place. It's not my job to pick up the pieces of a relationship they broke.